U.S. tariffs have wounded China.
Carnage, panic, bloodbath doesn't even begin to cut it.
Chinese markets deep in the red. Now Hong Kong stocks plunged the most in almost 3 decades.
In its first day of trading after the weekend, the Shanghai Composite fell more than 7 percentage points. That's, let's call it, somewhere in the ballpark of $500 billion in value, wiped out in one day. The Hang Seng, a measure of top stocks in the Hong Kong market, that was down more than 13%. That's another few $100 billion in value gone. And Donald Trump's not done. Because on top of a 10% tariff on Chinese goods imposed in February, plus another 10% in March, plus 34% announced last week, he's just threatened an additional 50%, which altogether effectively doubles the import cost of all Chinese goods to the US.
We're starting to get to the point where if all these are applied, you effectively create an embargo between the two countries where there's just going to be no trade.
Trump is punishing China for hitting back. In a trade war, the US has escalated. Yesterday, Trump says, China issued retaliatory tariffs of 34%. If China does not withdraw its 34% increase, the United States will impose additional tariffs on China of 50% effective April 9th. But China has found a way to hit the US back hard. And not just with tariffs, but by attacking its supply chain directly.
They just threw down the gauntlet.
It's now a game of chicken. It's who's going to blink first.
China is messaging this quite clearly. They are in it until the end.
China has, until now, attempted to exercise restraint. Months ago, when Trump first imposed that sweeping 10% tariff on Chinese goods coming into the US, China did retaliate, but with smaller sector-specific tariffs, mainly targeting US energy, coal, LNG, that sort of thing. Then, when the US stacked another 10% tariff on China, once again, we saw a measured response, this time against US agriculture, targeting very specific things like chicken and beef. But responding to Trump's additional 34% tariff announced last week.
So we're going to be charging a discounted reciprocal tariff of 34%. I think, in other words, they charge us, we charge them less. So how can anybody be upset?
Well, they're upset. Retaliating with an equivalent 34% tariff on American goods. This is China hitting back harder than before.
The Chinese believe the U.S. has just gone to a whole nother level, basically gutting the rules-based order entirely and replacing it with reciprocal tariffs negotiated line by line, country by country. And that's a world in which it'll be much, much harder for them to operate.
They want these tariffs to go away, but if they can't go away, they do not want to be perceived as weak.
But China knows hitting the US back with tariffs doesn't land quite the same way as the original blow against China. The trade math illustrates why. If we're talking about the physical things the two countries ship back and forth, in 2024, the US sold China just over $140 billion worth of goods, but it bought almost $440 billion of product, meaning a 34% tariff on Chinese goods, that has a bigger impact than that same tariff going the other way. So China didn't stop at just the tariff.
Well, China raised the stakes. It announced a raft of countermeasures, export curbs on tungsten and other rare metals.
China controls about 90% of the world's known supply of what are called rare earths, as in the stuff that makes electric engines run and fighter jets fly. They are the elements of the periodic table, some of which you likely never bothered to learn because they had such wildly arcane names like dysprosium and ytterbium. But if you're building an electric vehicle and you need a way to keep your neodymium magnets from weakening under extreme temperatures, you are heat-proofing with dysprosium. If US Marines are carrying out a nighttime raid and those soldiers need night vision goggles, you're converting infrared light into something visible with terbium. China recently added 7 new categories of rare earths to a list of controlled materials, which now requires US companies that need them to get a license for them.
You should see these new additions to China's export control regime for critical minerals not as more paperwork that will result in additional exports of these, but is essentially a ban.
They're realizing that they don't have to respond on the same level playing field of tariff for tariff. Instead, they have other tools they can use to impose costs on the United States.
This latest move adds to a growing list of rare earths China has either restricted or actually banned the export of to the United States. And experts say China has tailored this list of raw materials to exactly what the US needs. Some American aerospace manufacturers, for example, build avionics using materials that are sole sourced from China.
It's a real choke point. The US and others have stockpiles, but they will go through those stockpiles relatively quickly. And the Chinese are counting on this being one pressure point to get the US to back off or to sit down.
And if you want to understand what direction China's actions are taking the country, it's also worth paying attention to their words, branding US tariffs as abuse, which severely infringes upon the legitimate rights and interests of all countries, severely violates World Trade Organization rules, severely undermines the rules-based multilateral trading system, and severely disrupts the global economic order. It goes on to warn, economic bullying that shifts risks onto others will ultimately backfire.
They've been accusing the US of bullying ever since the initial trade war. They want to be respected. They want to feel like they can have a two-sided, not a one-sided negotiation over these issues, and they don't want to feel threatened by the US.
Well, China is, on the one hand, obviously having to take a more assertive posturing against US escalation. China is also essentially appealing to the rest of the world.
Trump believes China has badly cheated the United States. He accuses China of flooding world markets with unfairly subsidized cheap goods, which wreaks havoc on a country's ability to manufacture and provide for itself because they just can't compete.
As long as this trade remains unbalanced, I think the threat or the potentiality for additional tariffs will be there.
And you recall that chart we showed you earlier about how much more the U.S. buys from China than it sells to China, the U.S. running a trade deficit of nearly $300 billion. Trump sees that as proof that China must be ripping the U.S. off.
Trade deficits are no longer merely an economic problem. They're a national emergency that threatens our security and our very way of life.
But